Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're decoding the monumental legacy and, honestly, the very mortal reality of one of history's most famous figures, Ramesses II. We are going to look right past the towering statues and the ancient PR machine to uncover the actual man who ruled Egypt during its golden age.
So let's dive into the epic scale of this ancient propaganda. You've probably heard that famous quote recorded by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus. It literally inspired poets thousands of years later, most notably Percy Bysshe Shelley in his poem Ozymandias. Ramesses wanted his name to echo through eternity. And spoiler alert, it absolutely worked. But the story he carved into stone isn't the whole truth.
To separate the man from the myth, here is our game plan for today. First up, Ramesses the Great. Then, warrior and peacemaker, the master builder, the Ramesseum complex, and finally, the mummy's journey.
Section 1. Ramesses the Great. Let's kick things off with the sheer scale of the man. Later pharaohs quite literally worshipped as the great ancestor.
Look at his incredible 66-year reign. Think about that for a second. He ruled for so long that the vast majority of his subjects had never known another king. This unprecedented longevity allowed him to celebrate 13 or 14 rejuvenating Sed festivals, which were events traditionally held after 30 years to renew a pharaoh's divine power. He celebrated more of these than anyone else in Egyptian history.
And because he lived to be about 90 years old, he probably seemed immortal to the ancient world. But that long life came with a heavy personal cost. He ended up outliving several of his wives, including the famous Nefertari, and dozens of his own kids. Records actually suggest he fathered somewhere between 88 and over 100 children in total.
Beyond just living a long time, he was defined by his military prowess. He didn't just sit comfortably on a throne, he was an active, aggressive commander, personally leading at least 15 victorious military campaigns to secure borders in the south against the Nubians, the west against the Libyans, and pushing deep into the Levant.
He backed up all this power with a formidable Egyptian army estimated at a staggering 100,000 men. With this massive force, he pulled off some incredible feats. Like in his second year, he patiently lured the Sheridan sea pirates into a naval trap along the Mediterranean, captured them, and then, get this, actually hired them to be his personal royal bodyguard.
But despite this flawless, godlike branding, his origins were completely non-royal. He wasn't born a prince. His grandfather, Ramesses I, was essentially a vizier and military officer who got tapped to be the successor by the pharaoh Horemheb. It is a fascinating rise to power for a family that would completely define the 19th dynasty.
Moving into Section 2, Warrior and Peacemaker. Let's see how that military muscle translated into some incredibly shrewd international diplomacy.
If you visit almost any temple Ramesses built, you are guaranteed to see the Battle of Kadesh plastered on the walls. Fought in 1274 BC against the Hittites in modern-day Syria, Ramesses completely spun this as a flawless, superhero-level personal victory. But historically, he actually walked right into a brutal ambush. While he fought bravely to rally his troops and survive, logistically, he couldn't sustain a siege and had to retreat. It was a strategic stalemate.
And this brings us to an absolute masterclass in ancient political spin. Years later, the two empires signed the 1259 BC peace treaty. We actually have both versions of it. The Hittite version claims the Egyptians came begging for peace. Meanwhile, Ramesses had the Egyptian version carved into Karnak, claiming the Hittites were the ones begging. It just depends on which language you read.
Section 3. The Master Builder. Ramesses essentially covered the land with buildings in a way no monarch before him ever had, ensuring his name was literally etched into the bedrock of Egypt. He even moved the capital away from Thebes and built a brand new megacity in the eastern delta called Ramesses. This wasn't a vanity project, it strategically parked him much closer to his territories in Canaan and Syria. It was a massive city for its time, complete with huge temples, a royal palace with its own zoo, and military factories that supposedly churned out hundreds of weapons every single week.
But there's a brilliant bit of PR hidden right in these monuments. Older pharaohs used shallow carvings, which made it super easy for the next ruler to just sand down the wall and steal the credit. Ramesses wasn't having any of that. He forced his builders to deep carve his hieroglyphs. This made his legacy almost impossible to erase, and the deep cuts cast these harsh, dramatic shadows in the blazing sun, making his propaganda readable from miles away.
Section 4. The Ramesseum complex. When we picture ancient temples, we usually imagine empty stone halls for worship, but his house of millions of years was far more than just a temple.
The Ramesseum was actually a massive economic engine. Archaeological excavations have revealed a sprawling network of mud brick buildings surrounding the main temple. We're talking massive Western kitchens, textile workshops, a pillared treasury hall, and these incredibly innovative barrel arch granaries for storing vast amounts of grain and wine. It was a self-sufficient hub, basically managing the resources for the entire region.
Right in the first courtyard of this complex sat the Ozymandias Colossus. This was a single block of syenite stone carved into a seated statue of Ramesses that weighed around 1,000 tons, and it was dragged 220 kilometers from Aswan. Today, it lies completely shattered on the ground. It's a pretty striking irony, right? It was built to project his eternal power, but that broken torso beautifully symbolizes how all imperial glory eventually fades.
Finally, Section 5, The Mummy's Journey. If you think his life was grand, his afterlife was a literal roller coaster.
But before we check out his mummy, let's quickly address the elephant in the room, the pop culture myth that Ramesses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Hollywood loves this narrative, but we need to look at what the historical consensus actually says.
As historians like Lester L. Grabe point out, there is zero historical or archaeological evidence tying his reign to the Exodus event. State records don't show a ruined economy, a drowned army in the Red Sea, or a massive fleeing population. Instead, the records depict a highly stable, totally prosperous, and fiercely defended Egypt right up until the day he died.
So who was the real man beneath all the myth? Stripped of his monumental propaganda, forensic analysis of his mummy tells a fascinating story. He stood about 5'7". Under a microscope, researchers proved he had naturally wavy red hair, which is wild because ancient Egyptians associated red hair with Set, the god of chaos. By the end of his life, he was frail. He walked with a hunched back from severe arthritis, had hardened arteries, and suffered from massive dental abscesses that probably caused a fatal infection.
And his mortal remains went on an incredible timeline of their own. Buried in 1213 BC, ancient looters quickly targeted his tomb. Priests had to secretly shuffle his body around, first to Queen Inhapi's tomb, then 72 hours later to another spot, until he was finally discovered in a royal cache in 1881. In 1976, his mummy literally took a flight to Paris to be treated for a fungus, and he was greeted at the airport with full military honors as a visiting head of state. Today, he finally rests in Cairo.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for this explainer. Ramesses the Great spent a lifetime carving his name impossibly deep into stone and building 1,000-ton statues to project a flawless, godlike image. Yet, we know him best today as a frail, arthritic mummy who spent centuries dodging grave robbers. But, here we are, over 3,000 years later, still dedicating explainers to him, still marveling at his life. So, did his quest for immortality actually work? I'll leave that for you to decide. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the ancient world, and keep exploring.